Welcome back again to In the Meanwhile. Yes, you are hearing us twice this week.
Yeah, that's right, folks. The news cycle is a nonstop sewage pipe, and it does not believe in breaks, unfortunately. Um, while we were recording our episode for this week, news broke that an ICE agent had fatally shot a 37-year-old woman in Minneapolis.
And as more details have emerged and protests have grown, it felt important to give this moment the attention it deserves, not just the story itself, which we know is circulating everywhere, but the larger political and moral terrain that we're clearly being thrust into.
Yeah, so let's start with what we actually know, because that part is not complicated at all. No matter how hard the Department of Homeland Security is working to bend reality about what actually happened.
Right. There is clear video, multiple angles. There's not exactly a fog of war going on here. There is not a mystery. Masked federal agents surrounded a stationary car on a residential street.
Yeah, so we have one ICE agent who yanks on the door, screaming at the driver to quote unquote, get out of the fucking car. And then another agent positions himself near the front of the vehicle with his gun already drawn.
The driver, as we can see in the videos, reverses briefly, slowly, and then tries to pull away. As the car moves forward, the agent fires 3 shots directly into the windshield.
Yeah, and so the officer killed Renee Nicole Good, or as our local congressperson, Pramila Jayapal, said, it looks like outright murder.
I watched the video and I am stunned because everything that DHS has said, Kristi Noem and Donald Trump, are lies. It is very clear if you watch that video that this woman was shot by ICE as she was turning away from ICE and that she was killed. And that is when the car kind of sped ahead. The agent was not injured. You see the agent walk back to his car right after. So everything that they have said about this situation is completely wrong. This looked like outright murder to me. And it really just once again demonstrates what a rogue force ICE is. The mayor of Minneapolis was very clear. They want ICE out. The governor of Minneapolis was very clear. ICE is not making people safer. ICE is putting people in harm's way and killing people. That is what is happening.
Renee was a 37-year-old, and not that it should matter, but she was also a U.S. citizen. She was a community member known for her kindness, according to her friends and neighbors. And she was also a mother of 3 children, including a 6-year-old she just finished dropping off before the shooting. Now, all of those children will grow up without one of their parents.
And here's the part where most of us are sort of losing our minds right now. The government looked at the same footage that all of us saw and said, actually, no, this was domestic terrorism. And not on the part of the ICE agents, on the part of Renee.
Yeah, so in a truly Orwellian twist, Kristi Noem, the Department of Homeland Security, called it a weaponized vehicle, which quite frankly is a hell of a phrase to deploy when the vehicle in question is a Honda Pilot family SUV, not a tank.
Full of stuffed animals.
Yes,
full of stuffed animals. Yeah.
Full of stuffed animals. It's not a tank. It's not a battering ram. It's not an instrument of terror. Look, that language isn't descriptive. It's strategic, and it's turning an ordinary object into a threat. So, lethal force, sounds inevitable instead of reckless, which this action absolutely was.
Right, and cruel. It appears the car never makes contact with the agent. The agent walks away from the incident. The car passes him by. A car whose driver is seeming to try and leave a situation that agents themselves have escalated.
Yeah, and yet within hours, federal officials declared the case, more or less closed. You had our president, Donald Trump, talking to the New York Times, basically doubling down on this assessment that this was, justified. And I as absurd as it sounds, he had one of his aides, take a laptop and show this footage to reporters in the Oval Office, and somehow I guess he thought that he could do some magical I don't know, reality distortion force field upon them. But look, I mean, unless you are truly just trying to, be blatantly and willfully ignorant of of the footage, I mean, this looks like a murder because I
Mm.
believe it is.
And thank God for the leaders and the citizens of Minneapolis. I've always thought of like Minneapolis as like the capital of Minnesota nice. But so when the mayor of Minneapolis is like, no, this is total bullshit, and that's his word, not ours. Mayor Jacob Fry flat out rejected the federal government's account, calling it a garbage narrative, saying an agent recklessly used power in a way that cost someone their life.
Yeah, and it should be said too that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz called what the administration is doing a propaganda machine. And you know what? Kudos to him for saying what a lot of people are thinking, but for whatever reason, they're too afraid to say often, that ultimately the federal government rushed out a narrative, not to clarify what happened, but to control the story before anyone could ask uncomfortable questions.
Mhm.
And, as much as I dog commercial media, particularly the New York Times, particularly around, let's just be real, its coverage of what's going on in Gaza, I will say, kudos to them for at least attempting to ask some tough questions of the federal government, although they didn't get any true answers. But
Mm.
c'est la vie.
And it's really important to mention that all of this is happening about a mile from where George Floyd was murdered, which is really, it doesn't feel incidental. That context matters. This is a city that knows intimately what it looks like when someone is unjustly killed and when authorities rush to justify lethal force, when official narratives collapse under the weight of video, and when the grief of an entire city turns into mass protest because people have seen this before, quite literally, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true, Nora. Like Minneapolis knows the script. This country knows the script. The facts, tend to come second. The narrative comes first. And once that narrative hardens, it becomes a thing everyone is expected to argue inside of, no matter what the evidence shows.
Yeah. And it's really important as well to say that this is a narrative that we have seen wielded against Black and brown victims of police violence and their communities time and time again. This is a really old playbook.
Yes.
And once that narrative is set, pointing at victims and calling them terrorists or agitators or threats or just, not an angel, not a saint, right? The moral terrain shifts, the escalation, the bullets, the rushed press conferences, the refusal to reckon with what actually happened. Language does the work first, and it's used often to justify the violence that continues.
Absolutely. I mean, we see this growing pattern here where it's immigration officers are firing on people in vehicles over and over again. I believe there was a ProPublica report that said there have been 9 fatal shootings by ICE agents in the last 4 months alone.
I think it's 4 fatal, but 9 shootings.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, 9 shootings in the last 4 months. Yeah.
And this is the 4th time that one of those has resulted in a death. A woman who was shot multiple times by ICE in Chicago in October, she actually survived. But afterwards, the officer who shot her bragged about it in a text message, writing, "I fired 5 rounds and she had 7 holes. Put that in your book, boys."
Jesus.
This shooting in Minneapolis is part of a pattern of racist and misogynist violence.
Yes.
A repeatable playbook that shows up whenever state power is challenged. They escalate the encounter, they control the narrative, they justify the force, and they move on before accountability can catch up.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, Nora, right? One of the reasons why so many ICE agents were deployed in the greater Minneapolis area, I think in Minnesota as a whole, I think it's
2,000, I heard.
2,000, and in Minneapolis, the greater Minneapolis area, I think it's 600. And let's just be honest, a lot of the precursor to this was this narrative around the Somali community, committing fraud and so forth out of committing fraud of public resources, right? Which is ultimately is a very xenophobic, and racist and targeted campaign, against this community. And then in many ways you can draw it through line to you have more ICE agents there, you have more interactions with ICE agents, you have it escalate to the point where something like this happens. And so, people want to say, right, that words aren't violence. And I I get that in the main, so to speak, but I mean, words can certainly escalate towards violence, and I think we have seen this happen time and time again.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and we've been talking on this podcast for almost a year now about what it is like for communities that are under siege from ICE. These really are activities that feel like invasions of community space, safe spaces. We had parents trying to pick up their high schoolers from Roosevelt High School in Minneapolis, close to where Good was shot, hours after the shooting occurred, and they and their kids are being tear gassed by ICE officers who are on school property. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
I
violence for violence's sake.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, and again, I think it's to continue to install fear in people, right? That, you are not safe, right? And that no matter what, if you disobey, right, we are coming to get you.
Mhm.
And that your ultimate allegiance isn't to a constitution, it isn't to a community, it isn't to each other. The ultimate allegiance, right, needs to be to this administration. And when it's not, here's what happens, right? Um, I mean, I sort of infamously was joking around a couple episodes ago that, 2025 wasn't as bad as I thought, where there's no, imperial marchers in the street. Maybe not, but
Sorry.
there certainly continues to be, mass stormtroopers,
Yeah.
in our streets. And, this is what happens as, I was talking to somebody, and this is a person who definitely skews right. I went to college, in a more, conservative area of California, and they were saying, it sort of just had dawned on them. They're like, if this 30-something-year-old white woman who is a mother of three, lives in Minneapolis, and she can be killed with impunity, which is it seems like she's going to be, because it doesn't appear that there's going to be any accountability for the agent who murdered her. Then, what does that say about any of us? Like, can't any of us be killed with impunity? I mean, number one, I was sort of like, welcome to
Yeah, that's
enlightenment,
what we've been
right?
talking about.
But you know, and obviously this is a tragedy, no matter whom it happened to, but because of the way that identity works in this country,
Yes.
right? The fact that this was a white woman
And a
it
citizen.
and a citizen, right? It
yeah.
makes it hard to scrape away and dismiss her humanity for some folks, right? It makes it harder for folks not to be able to relate to her. Whereas even in 2020 with George Floyd, right, you had some people who were still sort of on the fence about,
Right.
well, I don't know, maybe he was on, drugs and it's fentanyl that killed him, right? I mean, to famously quote the washed up actor, Dean Cain. But here, I think there is potential, and I'm not saying that it will happen, but I think this creates a potential for an additional awakening that regardless of whether you're on the left or you're on the right, these are sort of universal aggressions that are, and transgressions, I should say, that are happening against us here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate you naming that. I mean, I will say, as a white woman who was watching all this play out yesterday, there was a part of me that was like, I'm horrified that this happened, but I'm actually relieved that it happened to a white person, because I know it's going to be harder to demonize them
Right.
in the media. And people might finally take it as seriously as they should.
Right. To your point, like I remember this is either a month or 2 months ago, right, where there was that ICE raid on that Chicago apartments, and you had little children who had gotten hogtied and so forth, and that was maybe in the news cycle for a few hours. Quite frankly, I don't even know if it was a day, right? And just that imagery alone, to me, it was extremely appalling, and should have at that time been, I thought things should have reached critical mass when it came to antipathy for ICE. But to your point, I mean, it's another tale as old as time, is it doesn't count until it happens to white people sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also feel like the entire world is waiting for Americans to say enough is enough. And Americans have to decide to actually do that. And part of what we saw this week comes out of this very long history of impunity and lack of
Mm.
accountability for violence. And, I was thinking about this for our conversation for the other episode that's airing this week, in which we're talking about, some of the imperialist violence of the Trump administration and other countries as well. I mean,
Right.
how long has the U.S. been allowed to get away with this stuff? How long has the world not been able to hold us to account? And at a certain
Yes.
point, like, Americans have to choose to make their own accountability.
Right. To do that, and also the fact that many of us, right, hadn't been paying attention to what we were doing, overseas. If we were paying attention, we just didn't care. There was apathy towards it, right? And I think, I'm not sure who said it first, but I know that my friend and the author and writer Ijoma Luo often says this is like, if you believe that these forces that we're unleashing overseas in terms of the racial and political violence and imperialistic violence that we're unleashing overseas and in other countries won't, come back to bite us and haunt us, then, you're just not paying attention.
Yeah.
And, this is a glaring example of that.
Yeah. I think where I am seeing a sliver of hope is in the ways that communities have responded so
Yes.
far. We saw vigils across the country last night, Wednesday night. An estimated, I think, 10,000 residents of Minneapolis showed up for a vigil last night. ICE is doing this because they want us to be scared. They want us to back down and stay inside and stop filming and become silent. And people are refusing to do that. And that is so brave. And it's so hard to do. But also, like, the more of us who do it, the safer we are.
Absolutely, yeah. And I will say this, to your point about the more of us that do it, I think that even people, and look, I I will never be confused with somebody on the right or aligning myself with right-wing ideology, but I will say, in terms of somebody who grew up or came of age as a young adult in a conservative area again of California, I still have friends and people I've known who, even though I may not talk to as often as I used to, we still have connections in each other's lives. I'll say, seeing them even become awake to this of again saying, okay, well, what are we actually doing here? Like, what's going on, right? It reminded me in some ways, because this is all connected when it comes to imperialistic violence, but it reminded me of a conversation that The Guardian had with a woman they described as Anna, who lived in Venezuela. And she was talking about this whole need to do away, at least in Venezuela, with the left-right dichotomy, of the sense of like, there is no, as she was saying, that why should we accept this binary where it either needs to be, we need to be under this authoritarian dictator, or we need U.S. intervention, right? Where she said, ultimately, it's like, that type of binary thinking is what stops us from moving forward. And I'll say this, I think I am seeing more Annas, if you will, in America, who are like, the binary can't be, even if I'm rightward leaning or leftward leaning, whatever, the binary can't be that we accept sort of this authoritarian dictator because we supposedly need to supposedly because he's taking on the system for us, right? I mean, why do we have to accept less, if you will, less democracy, less freedom, less true liberty, less empathy for other people in order to move forward? And so I do hope that this is a watershed moment in some ways for people to have a new enlightenment, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, I think along the lines of that binary, I think the other binary that we have to be just breaking wide open is this idea that our lives only get better by excluding other people.
Yes.
And instead to say, look, this is all of us versus a very small, very dangerous minority of mostly men who have been empowered to violate our rights, whether we're citizens or not. and we've got to start seeing each other as being on the same team. Because
We do.
yeah, I mean, otherwise, the electoral politics are going to continue to be what they are, but also, we're going to watch these kinds of discourses unfold around incidents of violence like this one in ways that continue to divide us.
Yeah, and I will say, speaking of binary, I, just to quickly touch on media, because I, and I know that legacy media is getting a lot of criticism, and quite frankly needs to be, but I will say this worshiping at the church of both sidesism that sort of originally came out around when the story was first reported, where it's, oh, well, Waltz and the Minnesota governor say this, and then Trump says this, so they're conflicting accounts, and it's like, we see the video. I mean, it's like, what there is no both sides here. There's what happened and what did not happen. And look, it wasn't just CBS News and Barry Weiss who was doing this. I mean, this was like originally in the New York Times. That being said, I mean, they did, I want to say today actually, did come out and ask Donald Trump some hard hitting questions. And again, he gave few answers to him. So kudos for them for making up for that. But that being said, like when people say that so many folks have lost trust in the media, I think it's because of things like this, where you are pretending, almost gaslighting, us into believing that there are, that there is an equivalency between what two people are saying, even as our eyes tell us something different.
Yes. And I think Kamala Harris even used the word gaslighting in comments yesterday. And, as many journalists who have studied police violence have told us over and over again, there cannot be a both sides when one side consistently lies and misrepresents the facts and misinforms the public and conceals evidence and does everything that these institutions, quite honestly, have a habit of doing in order to protect themselves.
Yeah, and I'll say this too. I think one of the things that I have seen brought up and by folks across the spectrum is, who are these ICE agents? Meaning, like, who, how have they been trained? How can they be held accountable? Right? I mean, we've lived in a system for so long where police officers are barely held accountable, right? Whereas you now have a layer above that in ICE agents who seem to be able to kill with impunity and not have any type of recourse. And I will say, I mean, ICE, I think they just recently announced that there's going to be $100 million essentially recruitment campaign for 1 year to recruit everybody from gun rights supporters and military enthusiasts to to people who attend UFC fights and NASCAR and so forth. And like, I'm not trying to paint everybody with a broad brush here or anything like that, but I am trying to say that when you're trying to recruit from folks who potentially have a predilection for violence, what do you think is going to happen when you put a gun in their hand?
Yeah. And what could be better done with that enormous amount of money that is being poured into ICE to actually improve our cities. We need to close this out. I think we could talk about this and talk about our grief for a much longer time, but I guess one place where I'm leaving this is to try and let myself be feeling the grief and the anger this week. Because I think sometimes when our hearts break, it opens a portal to new ways of being in the world. And I'm just trying to will that into being with my grief this week.
No, absolutely. And I will say, for there's so many people who come up to me and they say, how can how can we build bridges? How can we talk to folks who are sort of diametrically opposed to me politically, this and this? I think this moment, as tragic as it is and continues to be, I think potentially it does provide an opportunity to talk about sort of, again, these sort of universal transgressions that are being done, to us here in this country. And maybe it can be a step towards additional enlightenment for folks of like, hey, at the end of the day, this dichotomy in this particular situation of left and right maybe doesn't work. It just, this dichotomy, right? What the situation we live in right now is there's just right and there is wrong. And it doesn't matter what the president says. His authority shouldn't end and begin with his own morality. It should end and begin with the Constitution. It should end and begin with accountability to the people he is supposed to serve. And all of us need to remind him of that constantly. So
Yes. So we hope you will keep getting out there and being brave for each other, and supporting the many communities that are being so impacted by this violence right now.